Happy Halloween, everyone! Apparently this is a thing now. A semi-intentional tradition of reviewing somewhat Halloween-themed titles because I'm too much of a wimp to actually delve into something scary. Last year I took a look at Atlas puzzle game Catherine. This year, however, I'm taking a look at the indie darling Night in the Woods. Night in the Woods follows the college dropout May as she returns to her hometown of Possum Springs. Unfortunately, the comfort she seeks from the familiarity of home is shattered as she realizes how much has changed during her 2-year absence. Her friends are growing up and moving on, her parents don't understand why she's thrown away her education, and the rest of the town remembers May only for a particularly ugly breakdown she had thanks to her mental illness. The same mental illness that plagues May with nightmares to this day. If all this weren't enough, something sinister lurks in the background. A series of seemingly supernatural occurrences loom over the town, and only May seems to notice them. I've actually had this review on the back burner pretty much since the game came out, but it kept getting pushed back in favor of other projects. By the time I decided I had to force myself to finish it, well, Halloween seemed like a great fit given that part of this game's story takes place on Halloween. Even if I hadn't initially accounted for this bit of theming, it's a good thing I waited. My first playthrough back in April left me with an incredibly sour taste in my mouth. 8 hours of some of the best dialogue and characterization I've seen in a video game ultimately built up into an anti-climax for the ages, where it felt as if the writers took all the good ideas they could have used and threw them out with an abrupt and unapologetic shrug of, well, what did you expect? Those of you whom are more observant will have noticed that I used the qualifier first playthrough. 6 months and 4 playthroughs later, I've come to terms with and even gotten over that initial disappointment. But it wasn't easy. You see, the true terror of Night in the Woods isn't the supernatural beings that may or may not be lurking in the shadows of Possum Springs, but how close the game's writers got to completely undermining their own story and themes due to poor and easily avoidable narrative decisions. But let's not start off with the negative, because there is a lot to enjoy about Night in the Woods, starting with the game's art design. Possum Springs is painted in the colors of fall, a delicate mimicry of the palette of autumn leaves that could have easily become garish in untrained hands. The scenes and locations swing effortlessly from simple beauty to unnerving discomfort without it ever visually feeling out of place. There's certainly an attention to detail here that keeps Possum Springs from ever feeling artificial. It's the balance between the cartoony and the mundane that works so well that I find it difficult to put into words. And that's what makes Night in the Woods such a visual treat. Every screen is filled with subtle movements that help the construction paper collage come to life, so much so that the only complaint I could possibly muster about the game's visuals were May's costume hat facing the wrong direction, and the strange fact that only characters with protruding muzzles have mouths that move, while all the other characters remain tight-lipped, both of which are nitpicks so small that I may as well not have brought them up. With Night in the Woods, I couldn't help but be delighted with how so much was done with so little. One example that immediately stuck out to me was the visual trickery used with the Harfest play. A simple tilting camera with a cleverly designed background layer was used to give the impression of a lifting curtain for a stage play where no curtain actually existed. It's not just with visuals that the game succeeds, however. Night in the Woods is a wonderful example of how working around financial limitations can actually lead to a better overall product. It makes me cringe to think about the damage that would have been caused by hiring a non-professional voice cast just because games in this age have voice acting. The lack of vocal performances meant that good scripting was a much larger necessity, and it truly shines here without ever feeling forced. For example, the dialogue often breaks standard grammatic rules depending on which character is speaking, to the point where even if the text wasn't color-coded by character, I'd likely still be able to tell who is talking thanks to syntax alone. The rest of the game's atmosphere comes from the soundtrack, which I have mixed feelings about. It fits perfectly with the tone of the game, but I hesitate to call any of it particularly memorable. I would like to give the composer and devs credit at least for the amount of music on offer. A complete playthrough of the game is about 8 hours long, and the game's OST spans over 3 hours, meaning that you will rarely hear the same song twice, or at least the same version of a song twice. The soundtrack is laced with multiple arrangements of the same themes, which was a very nice touch. I always enjoy seeing leitmotif used in this way, but the takeaway is that with the exception of a few choice songs such as the Possum Springs theme, Night in the Woods soundtrack does nothing for me. I tried listening to it outside of the game at multiple points, and it has no lasting impact, though I will admit that this particular cover has gotten stuck in my head for weeks after I first heard it. Link in the description. I technically consider Night in the Woods soundtrack to be a success, though an unremarkable one, and the graphical presentation is simple but unique. In terms of gameplay, however, there's very little to discuss. Night in the Woods is an example of narrative-first game design. It focuses far more on conversation and dialogue than it does interactivity, which will be a turnoff to many gamers almost immediately. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that calling anything that Night in the Woods does gameplay is being generous. It's little more than the merging of a visual novel with the freeform movement of a lazy platformer. The game also contains a spattering of what I can only loosely call mini-games. Activities such as bulb smashing, knife fights, and band practice all offer close to nothing in terms of challenge or narrative fulfillment, but serve to break up the minute-to-minute monotony of moving from left to right, up and down in search of more dialogue to flesh out the world's multiple side stories. And monotony couldn't be a truer description of the Night in the Woods experience. This is not a game for those with patience issues, and not a game you're meant to rush through. In fact, the game feels purposefully paced to be digested in small chunks, about one in-game day per real-life day, which equals about an hour of game time a night if you're thorough in your exploration. In any other context, I would see this as a bad thing, especially since as a critic, I'm often forced to binge play through the games I want to cover. But for Night in the Woods, this all works splendidly. The game is a reflection of May's day-to-day life, how she is meandering with no sense of purpose, and that should feel a little boring. It should feel stressful and make the player impatient. It is an impatience that May shares. And this way, Night in the Woods succeeds at the ever-coveted but rarely well-implemented concept of theming through gameplay. Theming through gameplay or no, all of this monotony will likely be exacerbated once the player realizes they will need 2 full playthroughs of the game to get the true Night in the Woods experience. One to focus on the hyperactive, crime-obsessed Greg, and another for the lethargic but worldly Bee. As with most games with branching narratives, you will get the most fulfilling experience by sticking with one path or the other for a full playthrough, and that's what I recommend you do as well. The developers were kind enough to give the player at least one avenue to quell some of the repetition. May's laptop contains a game called Demon Tower, a top-down hack-and-slash title that feels like a cross between Binding of Isaac and Titan Souls, though without the polish of either. This is not meant to be an insult, however, as this is a substantial and welcome addition, an entirely new game complete with 2 different endings for the dedicated player who wants a little more from the Night in the Woods experience. Speaking of wanting more from the Night in the Woods experience, there are 2 prequel games available for those interested, one entitled Longest Night and another titled Lost Constellation, both of which have been released with a pay-what-you-want price tag. They're both only arguably canon, but considering how invested people tend to get in this game and in this world, I thought it was worth plugging them anyway, just for the sake of completion. All of this is simple background noise to the game's most important attribute, the story. In every conversation, the player is given the opportunity to choose how May responds, but it's important to note that the choices you make in Night in the Woods don't so much give the player different long-term outcomes as they present different pieces of the Night in the Woods puzzle. Taking one route in a conversation may give more insight into the history of Possum Springs, while another will result in a tidbit about the character you are discussing. This is not a BioWare title. The only choice of any consequence that you will make is whether you decide to hang out with Greg or Bee, and with the way the title is structured, that is perfectly acceptable. And in fact, I'd argue it actually becomes a far more interesting way to handle the story. Given that May is in herself not a person with any real power or influence on her surroundings, it makes sense that the player wouldn't be able to make any lasting consequences. At its core, Night in the Woods is a series of character studies, and your enjoyment of the title is going to depend on whether or not you can relate to them. May, Greg, Bee, and Angus are all well-written characters that quickly became friends to me. Possum Springs itself begins to feel like a living, breathing entity, and the more I discovered about the slow financial decay of the town, the more I wanted to learn about its history. This rings true even for the game's lesser NPCs, which are as colorful and unique as the art design itself. It's important to remember that Night in the Woods is not just one story. It is a series of stories being viewed through the eyes and ears of May, and in a lot of ways, that is where the game truly shines. The real highlights of the game are all the little moments that are peppered throughout, staring up at the stars with your old teacher to learn about constellations, viewing the world through the still hopeful eyes of a 14-year-old girl with big aspirations, even feeding and adopting some rats you find hiding in an abandoned building. Night in the Woods covers so many themes, but the most important is to revel in beauty and hope wherever it can be found, and it imparts this message perfectly. But in the midst of all the beautiful and haunting vignettes lies 2 very distinct halves of this title: the events that take place before and the events that take place after Halloween night. The slow burn of the character-driven narratives is all but completely replaced with a supernatural mystery that ironically feels dull and mundane next to the deconstruction of average people living ordinary lives that preceded it. This whiplash is what had me walk away from my first playthrough feeling so disappointed. While the progression of the mystery still had me curious and at least minorly invested, the way in which the mysteries resolved felt so rushed and inorganic that I was convinced it was only left in by necessity. It turns out that the original Kickstarter created for this game promised a supernatural mystery, so of course it had to remain in place or else backers would feel ripped off. It feels as if it was left in purely due to obligation, and that the devs had long since realized that's not where the strength of their narrative lie, but with the characters and the world building. Now, I don't want it to come off like the story never succeeded with the mystery plot. In fact, the game is great at building its narrative puzzle and interweaving multiple answers to the questions presented, all of which are plausible. For example, the very first strange occurrence in the game, which happens during the first night after May's return, is when May and her friends discover a severed arm. A few days later, if you are thorough in your exploration of the town, you can meet a young mouse named Lori who wants to grow up to be a horror filmmaker. In discussions with her, you learn that she is capable of making fake body parts. Was the arm May found previously a leftover prop that Lori had accidentally left somewhere? Or is there something more sinister at hand? And therein lies the problem. Night in the Woods writing is filled with absolutely brilliant, stunningly well-conceived build-up that ultimately struggles when it comes to the inevitable payoff, which is crushing for mystery stories because they, arguably more than any other story type, need to have a strong payoff. Unfortunately, this issue does not just apply to the overarching mystery plot, but overflows into the resolutions of the Greg and B arc as well. To be fair, in most games this wouldn't even be an issue. Even the worst of Night in the Woods writing is still above what is the expected norm when it comes to game narratives, but it is the striking contrast between the high peaks and low valleys of writing within the game itself that left me feeling so empty after my initial playthrough. Unfortunately, we've now reached the point where there's no way for me to be more specific about this without actually breaking down each of these main arcs. As I said at the beginning, the true terror of Night in the Woods is essentially self-sabotage, so this is where spoilers begin. Go ahead and pause the video if you don't want to be spoiled. There'll be a link in the description that'll skip you to the end of the spoiler section. For everyone else, strap in because this is where we get detailed. So, Night in the Woods is a game I feel the player themselves should experience, and if I wanted to do a true scene-by-scene dissection of this title, I would be here for months. So I will be assuming that you've already played through the story if you're watching this section. That way I don't have to re-represent every single detail of each of these stories. Instead, I want to focus on the main three arcs, that being Greg's arc, B's arc, and the overarching mystery, by looking at both what I consider to be the best moment in each arc and the worst moment of each arc, so that you too can perhaps see the striking contrast that continually threaten to rip me out of the experience. Let's begin with Greg's arc, as it's my personal favorite of the three. My favorite moment in the arc comes when May and Greg go out into the woods. They spend the afternoon performing such needlessly stupid acts as knife fights and crossbow training before standing beside a lake where Greg finally opens up about his relationship troubles and his own insecurities. Seeing the character that up to this point had been the narrative's main beacon of positivity break down was incredibly powerful, and never felt overdramatic, which in itself is impressive given how often these moments feel forced in any media. Now, I will be the first to admit that a lot of why I enjoyed this scene has to do with projection. Of all the relatable moments in the game, and there are a lot, nothing had me feeling so connected to the story as Greg's display here. There are few emotions more devastating than feeling like you are the weak link in a relationship you actually care about. Greg's short speech here had me reflecting on myself quite deeply. How he talks about staring up at the ceiling while lying beside the one he loves, thinking of himself as, quote, a complete piece of shit. How without the one he's with, he's nothing. It's a one-to-one reflection of what it's like for me to try and sleep at least a couple of nights a week, thanks in no small part to my own struggles with mental illness. My own connections to the scene aside, it is a brilliantly bittersweet moment. You get the sense that Greg truly does love Angus and is struggling to be a better person for him. This acts as a perfect lead into May's next night out with both Greg and Angus, which coincidentally ends up being the worst scene in the arc, though it doesn't start that way. The fight between Greg and Angus perfectly reflects the awkwardness of being a third wheel in a struggling relationship, and for that I give the game credit. I've been in that situation in real life, and I can tell you from personal experience that there are a few situations more painfully awkward than that one. But there is a huge issue with this scene. After spending the entire night watching the couple be passive-aggressive to one another, emotions finally come to a head, and after a small outburst, the three sit down and have an actual adult conversation concerning how May's corrupting influence on Greg has put unneeded stress on Greg and Angus's relationship. In any other context, I'd still call this a great scene. It feels real, and they really don't want to hurt May. Angus doesn't hate May, and he just wants Greg and May to behave themselves so Greg doesn't end up in jail and screw up their future together. This is punctuated when Greg says the simple but powerful words, "I have to grow up a bit. I did grow up a bit. May, you have to let me change." This is referring rather specifically to all the illegal and stupid hijinks the two get into when they are together. The problem is, May never once throughout the game's story suggests these crimes or pressures Greg into committing them. Greg is both the creator of the ideas and the one providing the pressure. This dissonance runs deep, as the player is given no option in any of these outcomes. As a player, you have two choices. Either you play through Greg's arc and go along with these crimes, or you don't get to see Greg's arc play out out at all. This calls into question the entirety of the conversation in the arc as a whole. The narrative does not support this outcome, which cut the emotional potentness of this scene almost completely. And the worst part is, it wouldn't even have been that hard to change. All they had to do was change the dialogue to make May the one that instigated these ideas. May is built from the ground up to have her own personality separate from the players, so it wouldn't have been a stretch to have changed the dialogue just slightly to make this scene work. It's one of those things that seems like a small detail, but when viewed in the greater context, it cuts down the theme completely. Now, this arguably could have been intentional, but if it was, it implies that Greg is just an can take no responsibility for any of his own actions and is throwing May under the bus, and this doesn't sit right with me for two reasons. The first is that Greg is my favorite character and I'd like to think he's better than that, and the second, much more valid reason, is that May is far too rambunctious and defiant to simply roll over and take such accusations. Throughout the story, you see that May has no humility. You see her defiantly stomp her feet anytime anyone accuses her of anything, whether the complaint is valid or not. So she certainly isn't the type of person who would just let Greg blame her for things unless she truly thought she was at fault. With all that in mind, I can't see this as anything but a mistake on the part of the writers, which is unfortunate, as it truly shattered my immersion in what had previously been one of the most relatable moments in the entire game for me. It was also meant to be the emotional climax of the arc, hence my whole self-sabotage description earlier in the video. That's enough about Greg, let's move on to B's arc. The best moment in B's arc for me comes pretty early on when B and May visit the mall. The whole trip is full of wonderful moments, a discussion of how the internet is killing off brick and mortar stores, a moment where May convinces B to shoplift, a scene that thematically would have been much more impactful in Greg's arc, by the way, before B insists that they return the stolen merchandise, and of course, some old high school gossip. Eventually, B's weariness from working all day catches up with her and she begins feeling lethargic once more, which May won't stand for. May hops her way up to the mall's rafters where she finds the control mechanism for the fountain in the center of the room. She then begins using it to spray all the patrons that happen to walk by. Seeing B react with uproarious laughter was heartwarming. It's one of the only times in the entire narrative where it actually feels like the relationship between May and B may actually be of mutual benefit to both parties, and not just a one-sided pity fest. Even the previous scene where the two talk while sitting on a porch showed that B desperately needed someone to talk to, but not May specifically. Here, however, it shows that May's particular brand of whimsy is exactly what the doctor ordered, so to speak. From here on, you thankfully still get to learn more about B, which is wonderful, but the relationship between B and May in itself goes relatively unexplored, and that's my big problem with the B arc in its entirety. I don't feel it goes anywhere. What's worse is that, like most cases in fiction, all the fighting and bull that the writers put on display could easily be rectified if the characters just took the time to f***ing talk to each other. I've been reminded that this is actually a common problem in real life as well. I fear for humanity. Anyway, this particular issue brings me to the worst moment in B's arc. B's defining struggle is that the death of her mother forced her to stay home and take care of the family business when she desperately wanted to go to college and make something of herself. To remedy a bit of her suffering, she drives out to college parties on weekends and pretends to be a college student so that she can have at least a small taste of the life she's giving up. Unfortunately, May accidentally blows her cover, which sends B off to have a tantrum, and eventually a fight with May begins. So setting aside the simple fact that this entire fight could have been avoided if B hadn't been too stupid to simply tell May that she was pretending to be a college student, the conclusion of the May and B arc is basically that, yep, they decided to stay friends after all. The problem with this from a narrative perspective is nothing was really gained here. Nothing was learned. B has changed nothing about her lifestyle and neither has May. The only difference between them from their starting scene to their ending scene is that they acknowledge out loud why they shouldn't like each other, but they hang out anyway. It's established that B actually hates May deep down because May gave up the one thing that B wants but can't have. In what is supposed to be the most important scene of the arc, it is decided that they are ultimately friends of convenience, that in any other situation they would not be friends at all, but like criminals sharing a prison cell, they're going to get along because that's all they have. What's even stranger is that the narrative tries to play this off as a comforting fact and not a sad realization, which is puzzling. Maybe this wasn't the intended meaning, but this is how it came off to me, and that's an incredibly strange outlook for this game to have considering it's being written from a millennial mindset. We now have access to the internet, something frequently discussed within the game itself, specifically in this arc even, which means that finding like-minded individuals to befriend all the world over is not only a feasible possibility, but a common reality. It's not even that much of a stretch given that B already makes over hour-long trips just to go to college parties on the weekend, and even 2 hours out in any direction would vastly increase the number of potential people to befriend. This also acts as a huge middle finger to Angus, whom B says she's friends with, so much so that's the only reason she even deals with Greg, whom she finds annoying, and yet there is never any dialogue or scenes that show this bond either. Yes, she could be settling on May because she knows that Angus is planning to move soon, but even that is never really discussed as part of B's fears. This whole arc is frustrating to me because the cynic in me related to B's outlook on life in so many ways. The fear of corporations and government meddling, a failing economies, and the fear of being stuck in a life you don't want or don't deserve. The fact that she is good enough of a person to suffer silently despite hating her life for the good of her remaining family is incredibly painful and incredibly real. And that's part of the problem. B is such a real character that the conclusion she comes to seems to go against what has been established. You see her constant impatience and frustration with May, and I don't buy that B would put up with May's long enough to remain friends with her. For what little it's worth, I can admit that with this scene more than any other, that my dislike comes more from personal bias than anything, and I can certainly see why this is often viewed as the best arc in the game, but I still can't help but feel like this friendship could have been explored further. That instead of a big fight ending in an instant resolution of, okay, friends because convenience, they could have continued on and shown a mutual understanding, or at the very least a striving for the two characters to help each other even more. As it stands, the most we get is one sentence at the very end of the game with the two characters planning a road trip. That will surely solve all of May and B's problems, right? Giving B at best a temporary reprieve from the life she hates while May gets to continue dodging responsibility. See what I mean? Just talking about it is making my own inner B come out. Speaking of cynicism, let's move on to easily the worst plot arc in the game, the supernatural mystery. This part of the story remains the same whether you choose Greg or B to share it with, so here it is. The mystery of Possum Springs turns out to be a Cthulhu-esque god and a f***ing cult. It turns out that Possum Springs is holding a god deep in the bowels of its long-abandoned mine shafts, and the cult has reason to believe that the god controls the prosperity of the town. If the god becomes hungry, it creates more destruction, but when it's fed, the town's prosperity seems to stabilize. The cult feeds the god by searching for drifters and nobodies, people who don't contribute to the prosperity of Possum Springs, usually through working, and throw them down the bottomless hole of the god. The reason May has been seeing all these strange things and having strange dreams turns out to be because she's heard the call of the god and has been gravitating towards it because it wants May to join the cult as well and continue its work, since the members of the cult are growing too old to continue the effort. And this is where it all falls apart. Look, I understand the metaphorical concept that is being explored here, and I appreciate it on that level, but Night in the Woods was trying to be an allegory. And a good allegory should work both from a metaphorical perspective and a literal perspective. For example, The Wizard of Oz and the everlasting popularity of its film adaptation come mostly from the fantastical story being told, not how the Yellow Brick Road is a reference to the gold standard or how the Scarecrow and Tin Man both represent the American farmer and the industrial steelworkers of the era respectively. No, I'm not joking, look this shit up. It bothers me that the game's many red herrings are actually the more interesting options compared to the half-assed decision actually used to wrap up the story. The fact that the mineshaft has gas leaks that are causing people to hallucinate, May's mental illness, potential ghost hauntings. Nope. It's a elder god that chose May of all people to talk to. The exact goddamn type of person the cult generally ends up sacrificing in the first place. A lazy, useless to society adult child is supposedly who the god is reaching out for to continue the cult's work. I know the connection is supposed to be that both the cult and May fear change, but that can be said of pretty much anyone at some point in their life, and it feels like an incredibly weak link when May can't even drive a car, let alone keep a mass-murdering cult a functioning secret. To be fair, there are interpretations of the ending that posit that it's all in May's head. Unfortunately, that way of thinking is easily debunked unless you believe that the entirety of the game was a dream, and if you do believe that, that makes the whole plot pointless anyway. You see, at least some of the strange events in the game have to be real and not some metaphorical construct. For example, the kidnapping during Harfest did happen, and a man did walk through, teleport across, or somehow magically leap a fence while holding a child. After the cult confrontation, a man magically appears in the elevator, despite the elevator having not moved to retrieve him, which means either he can make himself invisible, he can teleport, or he can fly and walk through walls as previously indicated. This means that even if the particular god that May thinks she's interacting with isn't real, something supernatural is factually existent in this game's world. Now, I don't think it's much of a spoiler to reveal that obviously the main heroes get away, which sort of makes the implications even worse. What ends up happening is they all get away and just sort of say, well, they all died and we're okay now. I mean, they might not all be dead, but this is it. We just gotta live for now. This is an equally stupid mindset for the game to present itself with, especially once we remember that the only power shown to be true so far has to do with movement, whether teleportation or phasing through walls, meaning that based upon statistics alone, at least one member of the cult could have possibly survived the cave-in, which means that cultist is definitely coming after these characters to kill them. Now, The one character that we know for sure has powers is Crush directly, but no one else in this cult has powers? That's certainly convenient for the safety of our heroes, especially given that the dialogue implies that the one man who is confirmed to have powers is a low-rung member. He's told to shut up by his superiors and then goes rogue, clearly a bad candidate for the Elder God to grant powers to, when there are apparently more loyal and well-reasoned members of the cult. I feel like a lot of people are going to think this is nitpicking, but it's not difficult at all to see how none of this makes sense or holds up under any scrutiny. I only had to think about this for a few minutes to realize there were a dozen plot holes that made it really artificial. The game's writers have gone on record as saying that any interpretation of the story could be accurate, which is always the ultimate of cop-outs when any artist takes that stance. Every artist I've ever talked to or worked with has had a clear intention in mind while making their art, whether they want to admit to said interpretation after the product is finished or not. This bit of factual occurrence remaining in the game means that either the god was meant to be taken as real, or the writers just accidentally left in some pieces confirming the god is real, which is sloppy writing. I'd also like to point out that the game inadvertently shows that the cult was actually correct, since the day after the cave-in where multiple cultists are sacrificed, a taco place opens up in Possum Springs, which seems oddly contradictory to the writer's own narrative goals, especially when they're using the metaphor to show how crazy and detrimental sticking to the old ways can be. Anyway, the rebuttal to my current line of thinking is generally that I should judge the game based upon what it is, not based upon what I want it to be. My problem isn't that the story went in a direction I didn't particularly enjoy, it's that the payoff was never as strong as the build-up, and the build-up itself offered so many more satisfactory solutions that were seemingly ignored in favor of what comes off as a half-baked, rushed, and unsatisfactory conclusion. Night in the Woods is an exploration of truths and inevitabilities, which is why its missteps are so painful to me. There is such an honesty and earnestness to this game that when it begins to feel lazy, it's much more damaging than it would be in any other title. That having been said, there is a reason that most people haven't even talked about these issues, and that reason is that the game overall is fantastic. It took days of lingering emotion after my first playthrough to realize that despite my initial disappointment, I wanted to go back to Possum Springs. With the Siren song, the game lured me back in for a second, third, fourth, and ultimately fifth playthrough, and I'm not the type of person who generally enjoys playing the same game over and over again within such a short amount of time. Why do you think the After Years has taken me so long to get to? I ultimately came to the conclusion that the underwhelming reveals of what may or may not be happening in Possum Springs did not undermine the poignant sincerity of its denizens and their struggles. But for the sake of honesty, for the sake of completion and constructive criticism, someone needed to put these problems on display. I'd like to reiterate, however, that in a lesser game, I would not even have thought this deeply about the way the plot was structured. So that alone is a mark in favor of the game's quality, not against it. If you take any message away from this review, it's the following. Play it. Play Night in the Woods. It's that simple. Even with the dissatisfaction I gleaned from my first playthrough and still admittedly carry a lingering version of today, I feel it's worth the time of pretty much anyone who can stomach the narrative-first structure of it all. In fact, I'd actually argue that it's not only a great game, but an important one. It has some of the most well-rounded and realistic characters in the medium, an attention paid to dialogue and inflection that is sorely missing in most scripts, and a thoughtful reflection of the current political and socioeconomic climate of the US as viewed through the eyes of the country's up-and-coming generation. Though, admittedly, it is heavily colored in shades of liberalism. So with that in mind, I can't say this story will connect with everyone who plays it. After all, the game stars a character who identifies as pansexual, and her best friend is in a gay relationship. Your reaction to that statement alone, positive or negative, will likely tell you whether or not this game is for you. If you do decide to take the plunge, I can confidently say that it's all wrapped up in an intellectual bow that puts it head and shoulders above the emotionally manipulative tripe we are usually bombarded with in this industry, barring the few missteps I went into during the spoiler section of the video. I've yet to see any media truly capture the millennial mindset and struggle more accurately than this game does. Every other generation has had a multitude of self-reflective pieces, normally expressed through books and films, that they can look back upon. And it fills me with genuine excitement that ours is being represented by the still relatively new but ever-growing platform of video games. In a way, this in itself is a statement reflective of the themes presented in Night in the Woods. Time moves ever forward and change is inevitable. Video games have long since surpassed the financial earning power of the film industry, so the time is ripe for their cultural importance and artistic merit to catch up to film as well. If games like Night in the Woods continue to be released, we may be closer to that milestone than we think. And I, for one, am looking forward to the changes that will come to the industry once that breakthrough is truly achieved.